Blood rushed to Clara's face as the billionaire's wife hurled the word illiterate across the hushed, Michelin-starred dining room. Instead of fleeing in tears, the waitress calmly picked up the highly confidential legal document from the table, cleared her throat, and exposed a secret that instantly paralyzed the entire restaurant. The ambient lighting inside Aura, Manhattan's most unapologetically exclusive dining establishment, was designed to make everyone look like a masterpiece. The chandeliers were dimmed to a soft, golden hum, reflecting off imported crystal goblets and polished silverware. At 24, Clara Jenkins knew exactly how to navigate this world of extreme wealth, even though she didn't belong to it. She was a ghost in a tailored black vest and crisp white apron, trained to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to pour wine without a sound, and to endure the casual cruelties of the ultra-rich without blinking. Clara wasn't just a waitress. She was exhausted, running on 4 hours of sleep, and entirely fueled by the desperate need to pay off her mother's staggering oncology bills and her own mounting law school tuition. Ranked second in her class at Columbia Law, Clara spent her days drowning in corporate torts, and her nights serving truffles to the people who wrote those torts. She possessed a photographic memory and an unyielding work ethic, but inside the gilded walls of Aura, she was just the help. Tonight, the restaurant's private alcove, a velvet-draped booth overlooking the skyline, was reserved for Henry Harrison. Henry was a ruthless titan in the commercial real estate sector, a man whose net worth required a small army of accountants to track. Beside him sat his new wife, Eleanor Harrison. Eleanor was 20 years his junior, draped in a custom emerald green silk gown and wearing a diamond necklace that cost more than the medical debt Clara was suffocating under. Eleanor had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to shed her past as a failed reality television star, reinventing herself as a high society intellectual and indispensable business partner to her husband. Rounding out the table was Henrik Lindberg, a notoriously icy Swedish venture capitalist. Henry had been courting Henrik for 6 months, desperately trying to secure a billion-dollar mezzanine financing deal that would save his over-leveraged real estate empire from quietly collapsing. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. Henrik spoke passable English, but he preferred doing business in his native Swedish, or, failing that, flawless French. Clara approached the table, balancing a silver tray holding their first course, a delicate amuse-bouche of smoked sturgeon and caviar. "Good evening," Clara murmured, her voice carefully modulated to that perfect, invisible tone the restaurant manager, David, demanded. "For the table, the chef has prepared a—" "Excuse me?" Eleanor interrupted, not even looking up from her phone. She waved a manicured hand, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking together. "Did I ask for a speech? Just put it down. And don't hover. I despise hoverers." "Of course, ma'am," Clara said softly, efficiently placing the delicate plates before them. As Clara reached across to set Henrik's plate down, Eleanor suddenly shifted, knocking her own elbow into Clara's forearm. It was a minor bump, but Eleanor overreacted spectacularly. She gasped, pulling her arm back as if she had been burned, knocking her crystal water glass over in the process. Iced water spilled across the pristine, white linen tablecloth, pooling dangerously close to a thick manila folder Henrik had placed on the table earlier. "Watch what you're doing, you clumsy idiot," Eleanor hissed, her eyes flashing with venom. "I apologize, Mrs. Harrison. Let me clean that up immediately," Clara said, maintaining her composure. She quickly pulled a thick, absorbent cloth from her apron and began meticulously blotting the water, ensuring it didn't touch Henrik's documents. "Henry, do you see this?" Eleanor complained, leaning into her husband. "The service here has absolutely plummeted. They hire anyone off the street these days." Henry, whose forehead was beaded with nervous sweat over the impending deal, frowned. "Eleanor, please, it's fine. Let her clean it. Henrik, as I was saying about the downtown properties." But Eleanor wasn't willing to let it go. She was agitated, perhaps sensing her husband's anxiety, and needed a target to project her own insecurities onto. As Clara worked swiftly to replace the napkin and clear the wet linen, Eleanor glared at her. "What is your name?" Eleanor demanded loudly. The conversation at the adjacent tables began to quiet down. "Clara, ma'am." "Well, Clara," Eleanor sneered, her voice carrying across the hushed dining room. "Perhaps if you could actually read the spatial dynamics of a room, or read a basic service manual, you wouldn't be spilling water all over my husband's billion-dollar dinner." But then again, expecting literacy from someone in your position is probably asking too much. Clara froze. The cloth in her hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto Eleanor's. "I assure you, ma'am, I am perfectly literate. It was an accident, and I have rectified it." Eleanor let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It was an ugly sound in the beautiful room. She picked up the thick wine list, a sprawling, leather-bound tome written entirely in traditional French. "Oh, really? You're literate?" Eleanor challenged, her voice dripping with condescension. She tossed the heavy book onto the table, right in front of Clara. "Read me the description of the 1982 Chateau Margaux, with perfect pronunciation. Go on. Let's see how literate you are, you ignorant girl. You probably don't even know the alphabet without sounding it out." The silence in the restaurant was profound. Diners halfway across the room had stopped eating. Waiters stood frozen against the walls. Henry looked horrified, not out of empathy for Clara, but because Henrik Lindberg's expression had turned to stone. "Eleanor, that is enough," Henry hissed under his breath. "Stop making a scene." "No, Henry," Eleanor snapped back. "I am tired of this absolute incompetence. She's an illiterate nobody who almost ruined the Lindbergh contract with her clumsy hands. I want her fired. Right now." Clara stood at the edge of the table. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a violent, frantic bird trapped in her chest. The word illiterate echoed in her mind. She thought of the 800-page antitrust textbooks she devoured every night. She thought of the intricate legal briefs she drafted for her professors. She looked at Eleanor, seeing not a powerful billionaire's wife, but a terrified, hollow woman trying to claw her way to superiority. And then Clara's eyes drifted down to the table, specifically to the thick manila folder that Henrik Lindbergh had opened. The water had narrowly missed it, but in the chaos, Henrik had pulled out the top document, the final term sheet for the billion-dollar mezzanine loan. It was printed in English, but heavily annotated in Swedish and French. Clara didn't cry. She didn't apologize. A strange, eerie calm washed over her. "I am waiting," Eleanor mocked, misinterpreting Clara's silence as submission. "Can't read the big words. Should I sound them out for you?" To prove her own supposed brilliance, Eleanor reached out and snatched the top page of the investment contract from Henrik's folder. She held it up, waving it like a flag of victory. "You see this, girl?" Eleanor sneered. "This is real reading. This is international finance. I've been reviewing this all afternoon for my husband. It's the final agreement. It secures the capital, limits our liability to the downtown assets, and guarantees our majority stake. Something your small brain couldn't comprehend in 100 lifetimes." Henrik Lindbergh raised a blonde eyebrow, looking at Eleanor with a mixture of confusion and profound distaste. "Mrs. Harrison," Henrik said in his heavily accented, halting English, "You read this. You advise your husband on this?" Of course I do, Henrik, Eleanor beamed, puffing out her chest. Henry doesn't sign anything without my approval. And as I told him, the phrasing in Section 4 is perfectly acceptable. Clara's eyes, trained by 3 years of agonizing, brutal law school exams, scanned the document Eleanor was waving around. Even from upside down, the bolded headings and specific legal structuring leapt out at her. It wasn't standard mezzanine financing. It was a Trojan horse. Clara took a step forward, completely abandoning the deferential posture of a server. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, and looked directly at the billionaire. "Mr. Harrison," Clara said, her voice ringing out clear and authoritative in the silent restaurant. "Do not sign that document." Eleanor's mouth dropped open. "Excuse me? How dare you speak to my husband?" "Manager! I want the manager right now." "Mr. Harrison," Clara repeated, ignoring Eleanor entirely. She pointed a slender finger directly at the paper in Eleanor's hand. "Your wife is mistaken, or she is lying to you. Section 4 does not limit your liability to the downtown assets. It contains a cross-collateralization clause hidden within a force majeure addendum, heavily obscured by the Swedish legal phrasing in the footnotes." Henry stared at the waitress, utterly dumbfounded. "What did you just say?" Eleanor slammed her hands on the table. "Shut up, you stupid girl, you don't know what you're talking about. Security!" But Henrik Lindberg suddenly held up a hand, silencing Eleanor instantly. His icy blue eyes locked onto Clara. The wealthy Swedish investor leaned forward, suddenly intensely interested. "Continue," Henrik commanded. Clara took a deep breath. "The contract your wife claims to have reviewed and approved is structured under a specific subset of European corporate law, Section 4.2b. If you default on even a single payment of the mezzanine loan, the lender doesn't just seize the downtown properties. The clause is written to trigger an immediate, absolute forfeiture of your holding company's voting rights." Clara paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the table. "In plain English, Mr. Harrison," Clara said, her tone utterly steady. "If you sign that paper, you are giving Mr. Lindberg the legal right to execute a hostile takeover of your entire empire the moment you miss a single deadline. It is not an investment. It is an execution order." All the color drained from Henry Harrison's face. He snatched the paper from his wife's trembling hand and stared at it. Where does it say that?" Without asking for permission, Clara leaned over the table. She tapped the 3rd paragraph on the page. Then, to the absolute astonishment of everyone in the room, Clara began to read the heavily annotated Swedish footnotes aloud, her pronunciation flawless. "Vid händelse av betalningsinställelse," Clara recited, then seamlessly translated it back to English. "In the event of default, the creditor reserves the irrevocable right to claim all collateralized equity, superseding any prior shielding agreements." It's right there, Mr. Harrison, masked by a minor translation discrepancy. Henry slowly turned his head to look at his wife. Eleanor was trembling, her expensive emerald dress suddenly looking like a cheap costume. "Eleanor," Henry's voice was a low, terrifying whisper. "You told me you had our legal team look at this. You told me you read the translated drafts." I did," Eleanor stammered, shrinking back into the velvet booth. I skimmed it. It's just legal jargon, Henry. It all means the same thing. She's just a waitress. She's making it up." "She's not making it up," Henrik Lindberg interrupted. The Swedish investor looked at Eleanor with a cold, terrifying smile, then turned his gaze to Clara with genuine respect. "The waitress is entirely correct. It is a very aggressive clause. My lawyers drafted it specifically to test your legal team's competence, Mr. Harrison. I do not invest billions with careless men. If you had signed it tonight, as your wife advised, I would have owned you within the year." A collective gasp rippled through the nearby tables. The ultra-rich patrons, who had been watching the drama unfold like a theatrical play, were whispering furiously. Henry Harrison looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. He realized in one agonizing second that his beautiful, arrogant wife had nearly cost him his life's work out of sheer, unadulterated ignorance and pride, and the only thing standing between him and total financial ruin was the 24-year-old waitress in the stained apron whom his wife had just humiliated. "Who are you?" Henry asked, his voice shaking. He looked at Clara not as a servant, but as an equal. "How do you know this?" Clara smoothed her apron. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a cold, sharp clarity in its wake. "My name is Clara Jenkins," she replied, her voice echoing perfectly in the quiet room. "I am in my final year at Columbia Law School, specializing in international corporate mergers and acquisitions. I am also the person serving your caviar tonight." Clara turned her gaze slowly to Eleanor, who was now weeping silently, her mascara running down her perfectly contoured cheeks. The billionaire's wife had been stripped of her armor, her absolute incompetence laid bare for Manhattan's elite to witness. "And Mrs. Harrison?" Clara said, her voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register. "For future reference, the 1982 Chateau Margaux pairs terribly with sturgeon. It overpowers the palate, but I wouldn't expect someone who can't read a simple contract to understand the complexities of a wine list." The silence that followed Clara's brutal, elegant dismantling of Eleanor Harrison was absolute. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the private alcove of Aura was the soft, frantic intake of Eleanor's breath as she realized the magnitude of her colossal blunder. Henry Harrison did not yell. He didn't throw his napkin or slam his fists. Instead, his posture shifted. The anxiety that had been radiating from him all evening vanished, replaced by the terrifying, ice-cold ruthlessness that had allowed him to build a real estate empire on Madison Avenue. He slowly turned his head to look at his wife. "Henry," Eleanor choked out, her hands fluttering helplessly over the spilled water and the ruined linen. "Henry, darling, please. She's making a mountain out of a molehill. We can just have the lawyers at Sullivan and Cromwell look at it again tomorrow." "Sullivan and Cromwell already looked at the English draft," Henry said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "You were the one who insisted on handling the final multi-language annexes with Henrik's team because you wanted to prove you were an asset to this marriage. You explicitly told me yesterday that you had the translations verified." Eleanor swallowed hard, her heavily lashed eyes darting around the room, desperate for an ally. "I did. I had my assistant run it through a translation software, and it seemed fine. It's standard boilerplate, Henry. You're going to trust a waitress over your own wife?" "I am going to trust the woman who just saved me from handing over my entire company to a Swedish conglomerate," Henry replied, his tone lethal. "Get up." "What?" Eleanor whispered, tears finally spilling over her eyelids, ruining her immaculate makeup. "Get up. Take your purse. And get out of my sight," Henry commanded, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. "Call your driver. You are going back to the penthouse. You are packing your things, and you are staying at your mother's in Connecticut until my attorneys contact you." "Henry, you can't do this! Not here! People are staring," Eleanor hissed, her face flushing a violently mottled crimson. "They are staring because you just made a spectacular fool of yourself, Eleanor," Henrik Lindbergh suddenly interjected, leaning back in his chair with a look of immense satisfaction. "In my country, we have a saying, 'Den som gapar efter mycket mister, ofta hela sticket.' He who grasps at too much often loses the whole piece. You wanted to play the brilliant executive. Instead, you have shown everyone you cannot even read." Defeated, humiliated, and utterly exposed, Eleanor scrambled out of the velvet booth. She didn't look at Henrik, and she certainly didn't look at Clara. She practically ran out of the dining room, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the marble floor, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and shattered dignity. As Eleanor disappeared, David, the impeccably dressed restaurant manager, materialized at the table. He was sweating profusely, having watched the entire exchange from the floor station. "Mr. Harrison, Mr. Lindbergh, I am so incredibly sorry," David stammered, bowing repeatedly. He shot Clara a venomous glare. "Clara, you are terminated immediately. Collect your things. Sir, your meal will be completely comped, and I will personally see to it that, if you finish that sentence, David, I will buy this restaurant tomorrow morning and fire you before lunch," Henry interrupted, not even glancing at the manager. David's mouth snapped shut. He froze, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of a very expensive sports car. Henry turned his full attention back to Clara. She was still standing perfectly straight, her hands clasped behind her back, the picture of professional composure despite the hurricane she had just unleashed. "Miss Jenkins, was it?" Henry asked. "Yes, sir. Clara Jenkins," she replied evenly. Henrik Lindbergh leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, entirely ignoring the manager who was still hovering awkwardly. "Miss Jenkins, I must admit, I am profoundly impressed. Not only did you spot a highly sophisticated corporate trap hidden in a foreign language footnote, but you had the sheer audacity to read it aloud to my face. My legal team at Wachtel Lipton spent 3 weeks burying that clause." "It was cleverly disguised, Mr. Lindbergh," Clara said smoothly. "Using the force majeure section as a camouflage for equity forfeiture is an aggressive tactic, but it relies heavily on the opposing counsel being too lazy to cross-reference the European commercial codes. And as your team clearly calculated, Mrs. Harrison was exceptionally lazy." Henrik let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed through the quiet restaurant. "She has teeth, Henry. I like her. I do not do business with fools, which is why I was prepared to gut your company tonight. But I respect competence. And this girl? She is dangerous." Henrik tapped the manila folder. "The deal is still on the table, Henry. But I am ripping up this term sheet. My team will draft a fair, equitable mezzanine structure. Standard collateral. No hostile triggers. However, I have one condition." "Name it," Henry said immediately. "She reviews it," Henrik said, pointing a thick finger at Clara. "I don't trust your Sullivan and Cromwell boys anymore. They missed it once. They'll miss it again. I want her sitting across the table from my lawyers tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. If she signs off on the English and the Swedish annexes, I will wire the $1 billion. Henry looked at Clara. "Are you available tomorrow morning, Miss Jenkins?" Clara looked at the billionaire, then at the Swedish Titan, and finally down at her stained white apron. For 3 years she had been drowning. She had skipped meals to pay for her mother's chemotherapy co-pays. She had taken out predatory loans to afford Columbia law. She was exhausted, broke, and constantly demeaned. She reached behind her back and untied the apron strings. "I am available, Mr. Harrison," Clara said, draping the apron over the back of an empty chair. "But I do not work for free. My mother is undergoing advanced oncology treatments at Mount Sinai, and Columbia law tuition is not cheap. If you want me acting as independent legal counsel to salvage a $1 billion merger, my consulting fee is $250,000, payable immediately as a retainer." David, the manager, let out a strangled squeak. Henry didn't even blink. He pulled a platinum phone from his suit jacket. "Give me your routing number." The funds will be in your account before you wake up. I will send a car to your apartment at 8 o'clock. Deal, Clara said. I will see you tomorrow, gentlemen. Enjoy the caviar. Without waiting for a dismissal, Clara turned on her heel and walked out of the private alcove. She didn't look back. As she pushed through the swinging doors into the bustling kitchen, she heard Henrik Lindberg's booming laughter once more. The following morning, Clara Jenkins walked into the towering glass and steel headquarters of Harrison Enterprises on Madison Avenue. She wasn't wearing a polyester uniform. She wore a sharp, tailored navy suit she had bought off the rack months ago for mock trials, severely pressed and immaculate. When she entered the executive boardroom, she found a small army of older, highly paid corporate lawyers from Sullivan and Cromwell, sitting on one side, sweating nervously. On the other side sat Henrik Lindberg's aggressive legal team. In the center were Henry and Henrik. Ms. Jenkins, Henry said, standing up to greet her. Please, take the lead. For the next 6 hours, Clara was a surgeon with a scalpel. She meticulously dissected the revised 70-page contract. The opposing lawyers initially tried to patronize her, a 24-year-old law student dictating terms to senior partners, but Clara quickly silenced the room. She found 2 more, highly technical, disadvantageous clauses buried in the amortization schedules, and ruthlessly struck them out. She negotiated a lower interest rate on the mezzanine debt by citing recent precedents in the European Central Bank, speaking flawlessly to Henrik's team in a mix of English and French. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the lead attorney for Henrik Lindberg took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked at Clara with grudging respect. You drive a very hard bargain, counselor. I just know how to read, gentlemen, Clara replied with a cool, completely straight face. When the final signatures were affixed to the contract, securing Henry Harrison's empire and sealing the billion-dollar injection, Henrik Lindberg stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and extended his hand to Clara. When you pass the bar, Ms. Jenkins, call my office, Henrik said. I will double whatever salary Manhattan is offering you. I'll keep that in mind, Mr. Lindberg. Thank you, Clara smiled, shaking his hand. The retainer Henry wired her that morning changed Clara's life overnight. She paid off the entirety of her mother's medical debt at Mount Sinai, breathing a sigh of relief she hadn't known in years. She cleared her tuition balance at Columbia, allowing her to quit her remaining night shifts and focus entirely on her final exams. 6 months later, Clara graduated summa cum laude, ranking first in her class. Before she even walked across the stage to receive her diploma, she had provoked a bidding war among the top 5 law firms in the country. She ultimately accepted a highly coveted associate position at Cravath, Swain and Moore, specializing in international mergers and acquisitions. As for Eleanor Harrison, her downfall was as spectacular as it was public. The divorce proceedings became prime fodder for Page 6. In her sheer arrogance and haste to marry a billionaire, Eleanor had signed an ironclad prenuptial agreement drafted by Henry's most aggressive estate lawyers. During the divorce hearings, Eleanor's attorneys attempted to argue that the prenup was invalid because she hadn't fully understood the stipulations regarding infidelity and reputational damage. The judge, famously unsympathetic to reality television stars, threw the argument out. It turned out that Eleanor hadn't bothered to read her own prenuptial agreement either. She walked away from the marriage with a meager, flat-rate severance that barely covered the maintenance of her leased Mercedes, instantly exiling her from the ultra-wealthy social circles she had fought so desperately to infiltrate. One crisp Friday evening in November, exactly 1 year after the incident that changed her life, Clara Jenkins returned to Aura. This time she didn't use the service entrance. Clara walked through the heavy mahogany front doors, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, an expensive leather briefcase in one hand, and the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who had fought for everything she owned. The maitre d', a new one, as David had quietly been let go months prior, rushed forward to take her coat. "Good evening, Miss Jenkins. Your table is ready. Right this way." Clara was guided to the exact velvet-draped alcove overlooking the Manhattan skyline. She sat down, sinking into the plush upholstery, and looked out at the city lights. She was meeting the senior partners from Cravath to celebrate closing a massive pharmaceutical acquisition she had spearheaded. As she waited, she perused the heavy, leather-bound wine list. A commotion near the entrance caught her eye. Clara glanced over the rim of the menu. Standing near the host stand was Eleanor. She looked distinctly different. The massive diamond necklace was gone, replaced by something much cheaper. Her designer gown had been traded for an outdated cocktail dress. She was arguing animatedly with the maitre d', demanding a table, her voice shrill and desperate. "I am a VIP. I used to dine here every week with my husband," Eleanor practically shrieked. "I apologize, ma'am, but we are completely booked," the maitre d' replied smoothly, refusing to budge. "And without a reservation, I simply cannot accommodate you." Eleanor's eyes frantically scanned the dining room, looking for a familiar face, someone to validate her shattered ego. Her gaze swept over the luxurious booths and suddenly locked onto the private alcove. Her eyes met Clara's. For a brief, suspended moment, time seemed to freeze. Eleanor stared at the woman she had once called an illiterate nobody, now sitting in the most exclusive seat in the restaurant, radiating power and success. The realization hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The color drained from her face, and her shoulders slumped. The argument died in her throat. Without another word, Eleanor turned around and walked out into the cold Manhattan night, pushing through the doors into obscurity. Clara watched her go, feeling no anger, only a profound sense of closure. A sharply dressed sommelier approached her table, bowing slightly. "Good evening, Miss Jenkins. The partners should be arriving shortly. May I start you off with something to drink while you wait?" Clara smiled, her eyes dropping to the sprawling French text on the pages before her. "Yes, thank you," Clara said, her pronunciation flawless. "I'll have a bottle of the 1982 Chateau Margaux. I've heard it requires a very educated palate to truly appreciate. Clara's journey from a struggling waitress to a powerhouse lawyer is the ultimate revenge served cold. Eleanor learned the hard way that arrogance and ignorance are a truly dangerous combination. What did you think of Clara's brilliant move? Have you ever had to put an entitled person in their place? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible real-life revenge stories.